welcome. Welcome to those of you who are actually here with us. Thanks for making it in the room. If you are watching online, welcome to you as well. We're actually live streaming this. Additional jeopardy means if we say anything cancelable, there's no going back. So let's just go ahead and do that. This evening is a little bit different. We've spent a lot of our evenings here at the UnHerd Club researching more sort of philosophical, cultural, sometimes even religious questions. Tonight's question is a little bit more worldly, more policy focused, and I suppose it does reflect a bit of a shift in emphasis, or we paid more attention to these more, I suppose you call them, geopolitical questions in the past year, for the obvious reason that there's been so much going on. Obviously, 2 years ago, almost today, the war in Ukraine began. We've had Israel, a lot of interest in the rise of China, in the role of America. And what I notice is that on YouTube and in these kind of forums, those geopolitical questions are getting a lot of energy. And they're right up there with the most sort of red-hot culture war questions, if you want to really get into a controversial topic. Either you can be seen as, there's a bit of a feedback on the mic. It's very easy to get in trouble for being insufficiently stalwart in your support of the West. If you raise questions, for example, about the extent of Western support in Ukraine, tread carefully, because people will very quickly cry that you are a Putinite or some kind of traitor, fifth column. But then I'm afraid the converse is also true. If you sound kind of enthusiastic about American power, you can also very quickly become a NATO stooge, shill, anything you like. So there is a kind of Scylla and Charybdis. There are dangers in all directions on this. And we like dangerous questions, so we're just going to go right ahead and plow into it. Today's question is, what would the world look like without, or perhaps more accurately, with a much reduced NATO presence? To try and work this out with us is Dr. Sumantra Maitra, who is over here from DC. He is director at the American Ideas Institute, a regular contributor to the American Conservative and the Federalist. He is most likely put it this way, if the Republicans win, I think we would expect Dr. Maitra to be in the Republican administration, pretty much calling the shots on a lot of these questions. So what he says, whether you agree with it or not, may matter a great deal. Insofar as foreign policy can ever be rock and roll, his recent paper on dormant NATO blew up. A feature in Rolling Stone magazine, no less, drew a lot of attention to it, and at the heart of that was the idea that former and perhaps future President Trump himself has taken a particular interest in this idea of dormant NATO that Dr. Maitra coined. So one of our main tasks this evening is to work out what dormant NATO is and what that means for us. Welcome, Dr. Maitra. Thanks for coming.
Thank you.
And also, those of you who've been here before will know Aris Roussinos. He is one of our own here at UnHerd. He himself has been a war reporter, spent a lot of time in war zones from northeastern Syria to Ukraine and many others, and his pieces at UnHerd are always some of our most popular. So we particularly want to see from Aris what this might mean for Europe, what it might mean for us, and hopefully you can help ask some difficult questions to Dr. Maitra as well. So I should also say he has just welcomed a new child, and so we were not sure whether he would make it, so thank you for making the effort.
Thank you for having me.
So welcome to you both.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Lay it out for us, Dr. Maitra. What is
Yes.
dormant NATO, and is it going to happen?
Well, the second question is difficult. The first question, to answer that one, dormant NATO is a strategy where the US significantly reduces its footprints in the European continent. It is contrary to what has been portrayed in media, not a full retrenchment. The US will keep its air force and nuclear power in Germany and Turkey. The second fleet is still going to be in Europe, but fundamentally, it's a burden shifting idea compared to burden sharing, where the logistics, infantry, armor, and all these things are going to be the burden of the Europeans. Command and coordination is going to be under European power, and probably the SACEUR might be the European, the Supreme Allied Commander, who has never been a European so far. It's always an American. And expansions will stop because you cannot have fixed interest for an entity which is fundamentally mutating. And those are the two pillars of dormant NATO. One, no expansion, the bureaucracy will be curtailed, and burden will be shared between the Europeans and the Americans.
So the first bit, then, the dormant bit suggests that it's sort of temporarily asleep and could wake up again.
Yeah.
In fact, it's just a sort of shift towards a more European involvement.
Well, the reason it's ECFR, which is the European Council's Foreign Affairs blog, website, magazine, journal, they termed it as NATO on ice, which is, I think, a good description of how it is. We have seen in the last few decades that NATO has taken out of area operations, whether it's in Libya or Kosovo, which are not directly related to the defense of Europe. We have seen the NATO bureaucracy take part in conversations which are not related to military, for example. I met this European ambassador who was talking about how Roe v. Wade is horrible for US, and I never really understood why it's his responsibility or migraine. Nevertheless...
So you think there's been a kind of mission creep from NATO?
Well, it's a bureaucracy, right? And bureaucracy, by its very definition, is self-sustaining. You grow or die. It's the same with NHS, it's the same with NATO, it's the same with Indian Railways, you name it. Part of the reason why NATO expanded post-95, and up until 95, there was significant opposition to NATO expansion, even in the US. But that changed because, unipolarity has its own momentum, the bureaucracy grew, chain ganging happened with the Eastern European powers. So I think that, in a way, will be reversed because of, one, structural problems, and second, the trend within the United States is moving towards a different direction.
So the little history bit of that is quite important, because that's the bit that gets people really upset, and is, I guess, one of the most divisive questions, is how much of a mistake the eastward expansion of NATO was or wasn't. You sounds like you take the view that it was a mistake.
I think it could have been done. How far of the history do you want me to go?
90s onwards?
Well, in 90s, the US and even some of the British establishment told Gorbachev that we are not going to move east. One of the reasons, the counter-argument to that is that promise was made to the USSR. USSR collapsed as a legal entity. The promise is invalid. Obviously, NATO expansion happened. People think that it was an American push, but the first idea of NATO expansion came from Volker Ruh, who was a German defense minister, from what I remember. And then obviously the Hungarians and the Czechs, Czechoslovakia and the Polish, they convinced Madeleine Albright, whereas Kennan and all the grandees of the American strategic establishment opposed. But then Clinton was convinced, NATO moved forward. The first reaction wasn't too bad.
So you put quite a lot of responsibility at Clinton and subsequent Bush Jr. then?
Bush Jr. obviously put it on autopilot, and after that there was, at that point of time, you already had 2 generations of the American security establishment who had lived in unipolarity. To them, the idea that Cold War was a balancing phenomenon was just obsolete. So I think that changed the direction of the country anyway. I personally don't think the first phase of expansion was wrong. I think that Russian reaction, if you study the Russian reactions in 4 different phases of NATO expansion, it was increasingly high. And I did a chapter in my PhD thesis which talked about why Russia was so determined to oppose expansion in Ukraine and Georgia compared to, say, Montenegro. And the reason is structural. Ukraine and Georgia is far more aligned with Russia strategically compared to Macedonia.
So you're sitting here in London. Obviously, we have a different view of these things to people in the US. The Russian presence feels closer. And I think most people, if they hear someone who might be part of a future administration talking about dormant NATO, cooling on NATO, will be quite frightened, because certainly for many generations that's been the kind of understanding is that's what the basis of our security. So if the guy who's advising the president says NATO should be on ice, we get frightened.
Well, first of all, I am not speaking for the president, former president, and I'm not speaking for his campaign or his administration. So I want to put that, because it's being recorded. I don't want to jeopardize my career that way. But second of all, why would Britain? What threat from Russia strategically is being faced by London? Do you foresee a situation where the Russian tanks are going to be in Polish meadows? Do you foresee a situation where Russia...
I'd like to bring in my colleague at this.
Please.
So in your paper,
Yes.
The argument you make is predicate on the idea that Russian power kind of dissolved itself in the mud of eastern Ukraine, that Russia is no longer a threat to European powers. It's a few months ago you wrote that.
Yeah,
the situation now seems to have developed quite dramatically to the point that... Well, I mean, Russia seems to be resurgent militarily in eastern Ukraine. Its war economy seems to be booming. Its productive capacity seems to be far greater than anyone anticipated a year ago. So within the past few months alone, like in Britain, we've got a kind of conscription flap where the head of the army is suddenly saying, actually, we may need to think about conscription. The defence ministers of Denmark, of Sweden, of Finland, of Germany are all talking about the possibility of essentially a full-on conflict with Russia within the next 2 to 5 years. There seems to be a specific piece of intelligence that obviously we're not privy to, that the Danish defence ministers alluded to, talking about a Russian threat. Has your perception of Russia's potential threat to Europe changed over the past few months since writing your paper?
No. The reason is, and I'm going to explain, the thing that I wrote in my paper is not that Russia is not a threat to Europe. What I said was that Russia is a paradox Russia has got no hegemonic capability, even if it has the will or intention to be a hegemon in Europe. But that being said, it's powerful enough to change the dynamic in its backwaters, in its sphere of influence. Threat in international relations is intention plus capability. I can intend to be like James Bond, but I'm short and pudgy. So intention is not everything. Second, if you see the aggregate power, so there is this theory called balance of threat, which means you can justify or calculate threat perception based on aggregate power and geographic proximity and offensive intention, offensive capability, and all that variables, and you can have a model on the basis of that. By that logic, the combined aggregate power of the European continent is around 540 million people, compared to Russia's 144 million. The GDP of Europe in the European continent without Britain is 18 trillion, compared to Russia's 1.8, 10 times more. The Russian Air Force is off limits in the Ukrainian skies. The Russian army has been decimated. The VDV, they were moronic that they sent the Rosguardia, which is like the Russian version of national troops, with Kalashnikovs in Kiev, and they thought that everyone is just going to welcome them as liberators, but that didn't happen. So they lost their top-tier troops. So yes, Russia is a threat to Ukraine, obviously. The escalation dominance of Russia is higher in Ukraine compared to us, purely because there is an asymmetry of interest. You go and talk to someone from Kansas, they don't really see why they should go to war for Avdiivka. That's a different question, whether they should go to war for Britain or Germany or France. So geography is destiny in a way. Sorry, yeah.
What's the counter view? Not that you necessarily hold it, but what is the counter view to this? The Russia. It sounds like according to Dr. Maitra, we don't need to worry about Russia much.
Without getting too much into the weeds, I think the threat posed by the Russian Air Force, it seems to be growing in Ukraine as Ukrainian air defence capacity seems to be being winnowed out.
Sure.
Russia's ability to regenerate its forces, including the VDV, seems to be far greater than we expected. So, I
hesitate to. Let me put it this way. The amount of training that's needed for a VDV troop, you probably know that anyway, but for those who know, is almost 3.5 years. They're not like normal troops. To think that Russia has regenerated their entire VDV, which got destroyed in Hostomel, is something which I have difficulty in.
Sure, but they're not being used as airborne troops. They're being used as, like, essentially very aggressive light infantry. But and then.
Do you believe that Russia lost 400,000 people almost?
No.
You don't.
No.
Because that's the CIA estimate.
I would actually. I think there's a danger of going too much.
Yeah.
Into
Sorry, I'll take it
weeds.
into a broader question.
Yeah.
That. If I was the Prime Minister or Foreign Minister of one of the Baltic countries, I wouldn't feel hugely secure in your statements. I mean, you could just as well make the argument that they're in Russia's backyard, that they're part of Russia's kind of strategic purview.
Yeah, but they're within the club. There's a difference. And second of all, the dominator doesn't mean that America moves away with its nuclear umbrella. It means that the patrolling that's happening in the Baltics will be more German and Dutch compared to American.
Sure, but when you say, the average voter in Iowa, wouldn't go to war for Avdiivka, would they go to war for Riga? Would they go to war for Tallinn?
No, might not. I mean, there's a risk of that anyway. But that's also probably means that European continent needs to rearm more.
So let's just spend a moment on the reality in Europe, because Aris, you can tell us, if America does this and withdraws to some greater or lesser extent, could Europe defend itself? I mean, if the calculation is wrong and if there is further aggression, could Europe defend itself?
I mean, look, I think if you type in all the aggregate numbers and GDP figures, like Europe, has vast potential, economic, industrial, military potential, as we've seen in terms of the shell crisis, the munitions crisis, in terms of supplying Ukraine. European spending and European potential spending isn't actually matched by the actual output, whereas Russia, with far less spending, is overwhelmed. I think, on munitions production, Russia's outcompeting the entire West 7 times.
Yes.
Right? That's the assessment. So
why is that, though? That's the key question.
Well, I mean, there are obviously inefficiencies within Europe, within NATO.
And there's this research paper that came out from Justin Logan, which said that one of the reasons why Europe is not matching the production with Russia is because Uncle Sucker is there to break the glass. That needs to change.
I mean, the US isn't in a far better situation vis-a-vis China. I mean,
okay, so then what's the problem in the US moving out of NATO?
I think the issue.
I'm not disputing it. I agree. But
okay, look.
But so your answer to the question of could
I think,
Europe
I think,
defend
I think
itself
Europe,
if NATO goes dormant?
Europe has the potential to do so.
No?
But I think in the time frame within which this is being discussed, I think there's a hunger gap basically between, suddenly turning all the Audi factories into shell factories, and then actually getting the output at the end of it.
I agree.
So I think we're talking a 5-year time frame for that to be realistic. And I think the actual risk.
Even 5 years, though, I just want to be realistic about this. If suddenly Europe had to defend itself fully, it would have to, basically, we'd all have to turn into a kind of war economy, right? It would have to be like what Russia is doing now, where the figure of 40% of GDP being spent on, munitions, I'm sure may not be accurate, but it's a lot. Suddenly, it would mean a huge change in all of our lives. It would be a kind of sudden emergency. It would be, funneling huge amounts of public money towards defence. Are any European countries ready or willing to even contemplate that?
I mean, it depends what the trigger is. That's the thing. Like, if Russia, say, if it uses the excuse it wants to defend the ethnic Russian population of a random Baltic country, I don't see the voters of Italy or Spain necessarily sacrificing their lifestyle to enable that.
Sure.
The defence of
but
Eastern Lithuania.
we are at an impasse on two questions. One, whether Russia is actually capable of going to war simultaneously in the Baltics and Ukraine and Georgia.
So I think this whole conversation is predicate on the idea that actually Ukraine probably isn't going to win this conflict at this stage.
That doesn't mean that Ukraine might lose. It can, at this cost, it can continue to go on for the next 2-3 years up until there is a negotiated settlement, which was always kind of like within the realm of possibility.
So I just want to understand one key thing. From the American point of view, or from your point of view, if it's not realistic for Europe to plug the gaps that would be left by a dormant NATO in the next 10 years, 5 to 10 years, what are we supposed to do in the meantime?
I think it is realistic.
You think it is?
No, absolutely. I mean,
but is that what we need to see? What I just described?
Look at the kind of ammunitions which are being asked for by Ukraine. 155 shells. The countries that produce them are Germany, France, US. Germany and France has got the economy to boost their production. The fact that they don't do that, that's a different question altogether. F-16s, an equivalent plane would be Gripen from Sweden, Rafale from France. Anti-aircraft missiles, the ones which are being posted currently in the Mediterranean, are the same caliber of the Italian production that they have. So
it would be a very dramatic
shift. It needs to be some kind of change, and I don't think that change is going to happen, as he mentioned rightly, without a trigger. And I think dormant NATO might push Europe to actually take more burden.
Sorry.
I just want to bring Aris in, because I've heard you talk about this before, and I think it's really relevant. What is the alternative future for Europe? Because there's one, if NATO recedes and American protection is no longer reliable, one future is that we all suddenly repurpose our industrial capacity, what's left of it, to arms, and we go full kind of 1930s rearmament. It sounds unlikely. I guess it would be possible if there was a real emergency. What's the other, perhaps more likely outcome if America becomes more isolationist for Europe?
I mean, what I'd like to see is, a coherent, sovereign Europe as an independent pole within a multipolar world, right? Sure. And I think what you're arguing for.
Can you just explain what that means a bit more?
So we've come out of the unipolar moment where America was the sole global empire in a similar position to Britain in the late 19th century, and we've entered a multipolar scenario where there's more than one great power, essentially, in 19th century terms. There's China, there's Russia, potentially India in the future, and the United States, which will still be powerful for the next few decades, for the next century, whatever. Europe underwhelms in comparison. It has great potential. It doesn't use that potential. And I think what's interesting is that Sumantra's analysis, it's almost the flip side of European analysis, which is that a sovereign Europe, a sovereign pole in a multipolar world, would be a good outcome for Europe, and that the NATO alliance essentially infantilizes Europe. It keeps us under America's kind of protective comfort blanket. However...
So you agree with that then? You would like to see Europe come out from under that?
I think that's the optimum outcome. I think where I differ from Sumantra is I think Sumantra's argument assumes that a sovereign Europe with the capacity to defend itself will necessarily align itself with America's interests in the future. And I think like if you look at your paper and also your American Conservative piece, there's a kind of inconsistency. On the one hand, you say that Europe, if it actually gets its act together, will be strong enough to fend off any threat from Russia. But then you also say that Europe, if it gets its act together, if America withdraws its security umbrella, then Europe will just kind of collapse within its own kind of morass of ethnic and whatever kind of national.
What I mentioned in my piece is Europe can defend itself as a coherent entity within the NATO umbrella if it builds up its arms and takes the security burden and essentially takes the place of American armed forces in the continent. Part of the reason is, as he mentioned, we are not even considering the other problem that if there is a war which breaks out in Asia, the decline of American presence in Europe would be like precipitous.
Of course.
Right. What I am, again, this is, I don't want to be Francis Fukuyama and predict something, and then, but fundamentally, I don't foresee a situation where Europe can act as a coherent political entity. The reason is the same asymmetry of interest that you've seen in the European powers would exacerbate the moment American. So think of it this way. The US tells the European Union countries that fundamentally we are going to provide the nuclear umbrella, the deterrence factor is there, but you spend more for the logistics and for the armor and all that kind of stuff, right? Europe says we are going to go one bit far. We are going to have PESCO and we're going to have the European, one flag under one army. At that point of time, the Americans say, like, we're going to pull out all the, even the nuclear power and the naval forces and all that. From my point of view, I don't foresee a situation where at that point of time, European Union, considering that's what you call Europe as a coherent entity, is gonna continue. Because at that point of time, questions about European nuclear umbrella, who's gonna have the finger on the button, whether it's gonna be the Germans, whether it's gonna be Poles. If you think the Germans are gonna agree with an Estonian with a finger on the button, I've got a bridge to sell. It's one thing to be. Again, these are matters of prediction, but no one can be like.
So you think
there could be
kind of chaos instead? I just want to pick up something you just said as well, which is you don't think a Europe without the protection of the US would necessarily ally itself with the US. What did you mean?
There's two ways of looking at NATO, right? And Sumantra's paper, I think that arguably they're both correct ways of looking at NATO, but Sumantra's paper comes from a kind of American standpoint where NATO is a vehicle for European powers to freeload, to free ride on America's vast military power and wealth, and so American taxpayers are paying for Europe's security. And that's true. Like, Europe isn't pulling its weight. Europe can't defend itself, and that is a pathetic state of affairs. But there's another way of looking at it.
Is American empire on top of Europe?
Yeah.
Stop it. Yeah, no, I agree.
Sorry. So NATO is much like Five Eyes in the Anglophone countries. NATO is a vehicle for European political and security elites to be aligned towards American foreign policy goals. And it is the case over the past few decades, whenever there's been any kind of movement towards a sovereign Europe or a Europe that can defend itself, that America has placed diplomatic pressure on European powers to de-risk the eventuality of a coherent European pole.
And that's going to happen.
But
I don't want to take, I'm not speaking for the American government, but if you've seen the American grand strategy for the last so many years, it's very similar to how Britain viewed Europe in the 19th century. The only difference is, from the British grand strategy was a balance of power. You give, funds and weapons to or pull support to the younger side if there is a war going on and all that. Whereas the Americans wanted to institutionalize the peace. Now, what happened from that is, on one hand, see, it's kind of like the Nordic mythology. Like you put your hand in Fenrir's mouth and you're like, you can't take it out. So NATO, on one hand, you're right, it destroyed it atrophied European muscle and led to decline of European great powers, which were the fundamental balancers of Europe. But on the other hand, it happened that same thing happened to the United States as well. Like when you see chain ganging efforts of countries which are, Trump, for example, wanted to move troops out of Germany. But what then happened is he then proceeded to put troops in Poland, which defeats the purpose of having Germany pay for its own security. If you put American men in between Germany and its fundamental great power threat in Russia, then why would they pull their muscle, right? So there is that contradiction, and I agree. But one thing that is not going to change, regardless of whether anyone who's advising the country, is it is unlikely that America would accept a European Union which is a coherent military power.
Yeah.
And that, so yes, there is that contradiction. There is the channeling of, you can't buy.
And the reason America wouldn't accept that is because, and this is following up on Freddie's question really, the reason America wouldn't accept that is as Europe in this scenario, as it develops its own coherent identity or capacity, America's interest and Europe's interest, and I think we see this in the war in Ukraine as well, are not necessarily
aligned.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So as they diverge, then Europe kind of slips out of America's orbit.
What direction does Europe diverge towards? I mean, what are you predicting or speculating? So if it diverges away from kind of being in lockstep with the US, who will Europe be in lockstep with, or it would just have its own kind of middleman role between?
I think the way to answer that is to go back to Sumantra's paper where you talk about the idea of, rather than actually Europe developing as a coherent singular power, mini-entente within Europe.
Yeah,
right.
I think I foresee that to be the.
What is a
mini direction?
We got to explain the jargon here.
France and Greece.
What is a mini entente? Do you know what a mini entente is?
So the idea of Sumantra gave the example of France and Greece, which have actually kind of allied against another NATO power, Turkey. So that's a kind of intra-NATO beef. But so we see something similar with Britain and Poland and the Baltic countries coming together.
Germany and Lithuania.
I think if we look at how, to give the example of the Ukraine war, like if we look at Germany as an example, through perhaps poorly planned sanctions, German industry has been atrophied. There's a populist reaction within Germany. On the AfD, but also on now that Wagenknecht's kind of populist left.
Yeah.
I'm just going to explain this. I just want to explain this as well, for anyone who hasn't been following this. Within Germany, there's the kind of right-wing populists, AfD, the Alternative for Deutschland, which we know about. There's a new populist left, headed by a lady called Sarah Wagenknecht, who left the left-wing party, and she is now much more sceptical about the Ukraine project. She's sceptical about immigration, so she's a kind of a strange kind of left, but seems to be getting a lot of support. Yeah. So within Germany, support for this Ukraine project, for example, seems to be diminishing. They seem to care quite a lot about German industry, which is being very negatively affected. So I guess...
So I suppose the question is, if our American patron, or master, depending on how you view it, withdraws its carrot and its stick, then the mini-ententes that develop won't necessarily be in America's interest. It's perfectly feasible to imagine a world in which Germany thinks, actually, we shouldn't destroy our industry for the sake of you.
Potentially, absolutely.
Actually,
so what did they do instead?
It's not impossible. Looking at the course of European politics, it's not impossible to imagine that.
That's
not an entente necessarily, but like an ease of relationships between some European powers and Russia. And how would America react to such a scenario?
Well, depending on how the ententes are, there has been Germany and France war fighting with Russia during the Iraq War, for example, in 2003.
Or even, sorry to interrupt, even before the Ukraine war, Macron.
Macron.
He'd go back to this old Gaullist vision of a Europe from Lisbon to Vladivostok.
No, I
bringing Russia into Europe's security architecture.
Again, I don't want to speak for the government.
Isn't this one potential eventuality of an American withdrawal from Europe?
Absolutely, and I don't think the American, well, at least those I know, are much worried about mini-entente siding with Russia. Yes, there will be situations where there will be misalignment of interests, and that's understandable. But overall, in a situation where they're hedging, to use an IR terminology, I don't foresee, again, these are all questions of prediction, and 20 years back it might come back and bite me in my behind, but yes, there might be situations where a mini-entente, France and Greece, I think in particular, might completely go against Turkey, whereas American nuclear umbrella is predicated on bases in Turkey, so Turkey is a pivot point of NATO. So yes, there will be situations where there might be difference in interests, but so what? I don't foresee a situation where they're going to go to war with the US.
Can I ask about this country as well? Because if Europe slightly kind of diverges from the US, whether it becomes more pro-Russian or pro-American, we don't know. What about us?
That's a good question.
Is the UK has its own little set of worries. Is it going to continue being this kind of Atlantic-facing country, sort of halfway house between America and continental Europe? Or will it be embedded in this new independent European security hub? Anyone got an answer for the UK?
First.
Sumantra?
I feel like we're going to disagree on this one anyway. But
me personally, I'm very bearish on the UK's medium-term prospects. But no, I mean, Britain is more committed than most European countries to the transatlantic alliance, and it's also more hawkish in terms of Russia. So I think your policy position places Britain in an awkward.
Well, that's partly,
and I'd be very curious to know what your advice would be to British policymakers.
Well, again, for the sake of recording, I'm not getting paid for this consultancy. I don't want to be charged in FARA in the US. Listen, the British position. Funny enough, I was reading up on Palmerston's speech on Tiverton in 1864. For those of you who remember your history, I hesitate to lecture you on your history. When the Germans invaded Denmark, the question in front of Palmerston was like whether Britain should intervene, because Britain at that point of time had a treaty guarantee with Denmark. So Palmerston went and gave the speech and started with this, the classical jingo. Every heart of every Englishman is bleeding because of the, poor Danes. And then ended by saying, no matter what, if we send 30,000 troops, the Germans are going to send 300,000. So he kind of like explained the escalation dominance and said that at the end of the day, intervention, which doesn't change the broad balance of power in the European continent, is in no effect to British interests and honour. I think there are three strategic versions in front of Britain. On one hand is the current one, double down on liberal international order. I was talking with Freddie the other day, like before Brexit, I wrote a memo for one of the two top foreign policy think tanks, which I can't name, in London, saying that if Brexit happens, then you guys have to decide on whether you want to have a trade deal with the US, have some kind of entente with Russia, decide on whether you're going to balance the European Union. So obviously that was discarded because it was too provocative.
It was rejected.
It was rejected by... Anyway,
the unnamed thing.
The unnamed, right. One of the top two. Anyway, so the position number one is doubling down.
But what's the point of that story? The point is that
the UK
this establishment is very
dogmatic,
conservative.
They are not conservative. If they were conservative, they wouldn't be spending money in Ukraine.
Cautious.
Dogmatic about this last 20, 30 years of liberal international order, and they want to double down on that. So that's angle one. Number two is being more aligned with the European Union. The political situation of this country disallows that kind of alignment to the extreme. There are possibilities of economic and financial and military ties, but I don't see a situation where a Brit would be happy with a German finger on the nuclear button in a chain of command of European Union. So I don't see that's going to happen. The third is a classical British position, which has been throughout history and is now sort of forgotten, is a more detached, not isolationist. Britain was never really isolationist. It had the empire behind it, but fundamentally detached from the two poles, both the US and Europe. Seafaring nation, having its interests on both sides, kind of agreeing with one side, agreeing with the other, playing a small balancing role, having strong navy, big industrial power, which I'd assume would agree with me. Britain needs to focus more on its own industry.
So does that mean if
a third pole, Britain geographically is in a position which is ideal to have to be a balancing power. Whether it wants to do that or not is a political question.
And that includes China, presumably, or India, or any of these new emergent powers.
I mean, I think trade with China is a bit dangerous compared to how much Chinese government interferes in trade deals. You can have So, for example, trusting an Australian software in AUKUS is different qualitatively than trusting a Chinese software in your bank. It doesn't mean that you shouldn't trade with either of those two countries or go to war with either of them, but it's a fact. So even when you're playing a balancing act or balancing power, you still have to decide on which powers you want to align with and who you want to be a bit more detached from. So I think you mentioned Five Eyes. I think there is this research paper that came out recently, I think, from one of the think tanks about AUKUS Plus with Canada and trade with the US. I don't think it serves British interests to be more hawkish in Ukraine compared to, it's being more Catholic than the Pope. The American conservatives don't want to go in Ukraine because they don't want to spend too much money. And Britain is in an ideal position where you can actually bypass the security guarantee to Europe. It doesn't do that. I don't understand why. I mean, part of the reason, again, our hypothesis is British interest is seeing a disunited Europe, seeing some kind of conflict going on in the European continent means that America is going to be there forever. But I think that's a risky gamble. I don't think that's going to happen. Even if you see the polling within the Democrats or within the left, the retrenchment tendencies is very high on both sides. So I don't think you guys should be more hawkish than US when it comes to Ukraine.
We are going to take a very short break. This is the bit where we have just been talking amongst ourselves. We now want to invite you guys to join in, both asking questions or saying if you have points, and that includes online audience. We are going to be taking questions from you as well. So let's take a 10-minute break and then let's open it out. Thanks.
Thank you.
Hi, welcome back. If you're watching online, welcome back in the room. We are tackling some pretty big issues this evening. It can get quite technical and foreign policy-ish, and my job is to try to make it sound a little bit more understandable to people like me who are not deep in the weeds of different theories of international relations. We haven't yet talked about China, haven't talked about Israel, haven't actually talked about Ukraine that much, so there is a lot of chunky stuff there if we want to go there. And mainly we want to hear from you, so we can take questions from in the room. We can also take questions online, because you may have noticed Florence is here. Yes! Normally she is. Normally Florence, I should say, is conducting interviews here. I'm conscious that she seems to have been relegated to a sort of assistant role on this particular evening. That is not normally the case. In fact, she will be interviewing Abigail Schreier next week, I believe. So definitely tune in for that. That should be interesting. Let's get some questions in the room. Raise your hand. Yes, there's one over here.
Thank you very much. Fantastic talk. Doctor, this question of what
Is the mic working there?
Hello?
Yeah.
Can you hear me? Yeah. This question of what Trump will do if he does win the November election. Per my understanding, if he wishes to withdraw from NATO, the Senate has to ratify any decision the executive branch makes. Though I've heard one interpretation that says constitutionally the executive branch can withdraw from any treaty that even if the Senate has ratified it. Is that correct, or is that not correct?
So that's a good question. Two points. One, no international treaty supersedes Article 1 of the Constitution. So even, for example, which is the war powers are in the hands of the Congress. So even if tomorrow there is a war in Europe and Article 5 is implanted on top of DC, what Article 5 would essentially start is a negotiation between the various NATO partners on what to do after that. It will still go to the Congress. The Congress is going to decide whether how much they want to do. So that's number one. Number two is, yes, if Trump wants to unilaterally withdraw from NATO, that's not going to happen. That is not going to happen. There has been already efforts in the Senate to stop that. And dormant NATO actually doesn't talk about withdrawing from NATO anyway. Contrary to public opinion, it's actually a moderate position. There are far more extreme voices in the US which wants to move out and have a kind of like 19th century isolationist policy. Such as focus on the Western Hemisphere.
But who are the voices?
That I cannot say. There are
no public ones.
There are voices, there are voices even within the Republican Party who would want to go full isolationist. That's a very minimal position, mercifully. And again, the structural forces of the world will not allow any country to go completely isolationist. It's utopian. It's the other fringe, the other side of the same utopian idea.
So if we're kind of betting on what might happen, if Trump wins the presidency, probably an actual withdrawal or sort of cancellation of NATO is very unlikely.
Yeah, absolutely.
But some version, it depends on degree, some version of insisting on greater European responsibility for their own security is inevitable.
Yes.
Almost, it's guaranteed.
Absolutely, yeah. The beauty of dormant NATO, if I may say so, is that you don't have to do anything to make it go to sleep. You have to just essentially put pressure on Europe and move your troops out. Give a timeline and say, here it's 2025, 2027, we are out. All the striker brigades are gone. Figure it out yourself. Not that that's going to happen. I'm just saying that is one possibility. I don't foresee any rapid change in the European security structure, but there will be a lot more pressure on, especially on Western Europe. Eastern Europe, for good or for bad, regardless of the chain ganging tendencies and their ethnic rivalries, they have spent a lot more money because they feel the threat of Russia. Netherlands, Belgium, not so much. One of the most, we were just talking just a few moments back, one of the most hawkish person is the Netherlands defense minister who was constantly in the Atlantic Council in DC talking about how Europe should pull together. Netherlands is one of the richest countries of Europe with a defense spending of 1.1, which was in 2007, it's now 1.6. Massive change. Yeah. So there's obviously going to be a lot more pressure on Western Europe.
Let's just have the counter view, because actually we were mentioning this earlier. It feels like every president says they're going to pivot to Asia or they're going to require Europe to step up its spending, including Trump 1. And every time it doesn't really happen that much. Aris, paint us the other scenario where there's all this talk, we have emergency sessions at the UnHerd Club, and actually in 5 years' time, things are exactly as they are today.
Yeah, I mean, I do wonder about this. Obama initiated the pivot to Asia.
And then Arab Spring happened.
So I remember that Obama's pivot to Asia, every American president has had a pivot to Asia, and it's never happened. So you say the revealed preference of Western European states is that Russia isn't actually a threat, and
That's the
but then the revealed preference, the inverse.
I
the
agree.
revealed preference of American presidents is us to stay bogged down or engaged, depending on how you want to view it, in Europe and the Middle East.
Yeah.
So, what makes you think it's going to be different this time?
I don't. I'm not guaranteeing anything, by the way. The counter to that counter argument is, on one hand, yes, Bush the second came to power saying that you need to focus on China, and then 9/11 happened, and everything changed. Obama came to power, and in the Security Council meeting, in the Situation Room, he never wanted to go to Libya, and then Suzanne Rice had the power, and Hillary Clinton were in support of an intervention, and Biden and Gates were opposed to it, and then obviously that was decided in favor, and then Arab Spring happened and all that. The question then becomes whether any similar situation happened before, when we see a peer rival of China, of a scale and scope of China, invade a country. Now, again, that is a question which might or might not happen, but it is a possibility.
I think we've got to keep China for a separate question.
My point is, we haven't seen a situation where a genuine peer rival has threatened the American hegemony.
So you think this time might be different?
If that happens, I mean, it's a variable.
Okay, let's get another question, Flo, from the online audience.
Yeah, so this one's from Diesel, who asks, the political and economic decline of Germany in the last couple of years has been abrupt and shocking. The EU has no hegemon left, so how would a multipolar EU play out in strategic terms?
Quite a carefully chosen avatar name there, if he's complaining about German industrial decline.
There isn't. I agree with Diesel, Mr. Diesel or Miss Diesel, whoever. I don't think the European Union has, or there is a possibility of a hegemon in the European continent. And one of the reasons why Russia is a threat to its local powers, to its local sphere of influence, is completely different than having, the Third Reich, and see the scope of invasion. I mean, the entire scope of invasion when it started in Ukraine was 90,000 troops. Obviously, they got bogged down and killed. And then, even at its height of power, Russians had around 350,000 troops based in Eastern Europe, in Eastern Ukraine. Compared to Operation Barbarossa, Germans had 4 million troops moving at the same time. It's easy to say, yes, we are going to see a multipolar world and there's going to be a hegemon in Europe. The structural realities of Europe just rearming up to the point, it takes 20, 30 years to be in that kind of situation, to be a hegemon. There are hegemonic threats in Asia, obviously, as we are going to talk about China anyway, but just to give a scope, the total Chinese manpower is 1.6 billion people. They have the production capacity, which is more than the combined production capacity of US, UK, European Union, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand. The scope of threat, if that goes on a war footing, is something which we haven't even thought about or grappled. I don't want to oversell the Chinese threat. I don't know whether they're going to go to war. But in international relations, you don't design policy on the basis of what might happen. You have to have, variables on that question.
Can I follow up? I know you want to talk about China later, but
let's do it now.
Okay. I do think, given the scale of the Chinese challenge to the US, America has never faced a challenger like China.
No.
Not the Soviet Union,
no.
Not Nazi Germany. Its industrial capacity is almost unimaginable.
Yeah.
It is already, on some statistics, a greater naval power than the US, and that capacity is growing.
Concentrated in the theatre, yes, absolutely.
It has tremendous advantages over the US in terms of just distance and logistics in a war over Taiwan. So to put it at best, I think America's chances of victory over China in a conflict in Taiwan, I would say, are variable, right?
Okay.
I don't think it's guaranteed.
By variable, you
No,
mean
no,
less
absolutely.
than 50%?
Yeah.
Or,
Yeah.
So I'm just
so
going to research. Do you
therefore-
think if there is an American-Chinese standoff around the Taiwan issue, you think America loses?
I don't think it even gets to that stage. I don't think America has the political stability internally.
Yeah.
I don't think it has the political will to even marshal its resources towards this huge a war effort like the American people have never known before. So if that's the situation, then the path of least resistance, the easiest option, is for the US to kind of to hug Europe closer, if that makes sense.
Sure.
Right?
Yeah.
Because we already have, pliable elites. The Russian threat is far smaller than the Chinese one. So that's actually the easiest option for the US, to kind of give up.
Depends on what hugging Europe means in practical policy. I am all for hugging Europe, absolutely.
I think it means retrenching to a core empire in Europe, essentially. And again, we go back to the revealed preference of US elites.
To take your question about China, I agree on the fact that the US has never faced a challenge to the scope of China. And this is not being hyperbolic. It's if you think the great power challenges that the US has faced in the course of its history, the Spanish Empire, Imperial Germany, Nazi Germany, Imperial Japan, Soviet Union, you compare their GDP percentage and tally that with American GDP and production capacity in their peak power. So when the Soviets were in their peak power compared to when the Americans were in their peak power, it's nothing compared to what China is. China is a giant. The good thing about that, though, is one, Asia in 2023 is not similar to 1949 Europe. The great powers are not decimated. Soviet Union is hulking production with a massive production capacity, just on a rampage in a continent, land power. China is a land power, but it's on the north. It's bordered by the Soviet Union, and around China there is Japan, a massive naval power, India, a nuclear power, Vietnam and Philippines, who are both treaty allies with the US, Australia, far away. So the structural reality of the geography favors the United States. That being said, I don't think the US has the capacity the will, maybe, but again, it's intention and capability. I don't think the US has the capacity at this point of time to go toe-to-toe with Taiwan. Think of it this way. In the first hour of war in the South China Sea, provided the US decides that they are going to defend Taiwan, the Chinese coastal missile batteries are going to sink at least 2 carrier groups. That's 12,000 dead in 1 hour, 4 times 911. That amount of death we haven't seen since the Second World War. To suddenly have a country think that this is normal and we are going to continue and go and defend, I don't think they have the appetite to do that. That being said, as we were talking just before, Taiwan is a pretty big island. Seaborne invasions are always difficult. The same A to AD dynamics that goes between China and Taiwan is also the same that is opposed to China. If China wants to invade Taiwan with their seaborne troops, the defense 3-to-1 ratio takes a lot less to defend an island than to go and conquer. Even after Taiwan is conquered, pacification is a whole different game altogether with 24 million people, heavily armed. We are constantly arming them. Their model is different. They spend 1.2%, but we are trying to channel them towards buying more insurgency weapons compared to, fighter jets and stuff, because they're never going to go toe-to-toe with the Chinese Air Force. But what they can do is have guns in every house. That changes the dynamic of Chinese invasion. So there are a lot of things going on.
I'm pretty sure that under this or in the comments, there's going to be lots of people saying these are warmongers sitting on the sofa. Some of them seem to favour Russia, some of them seem to favour China, but everyone seems to be getting quite excited about tanks and toys and industrial capacity. And
I want to reassure I'm as opposed to great power war as Lord Lansdowne. So I don't like great power war.
Is there any sense of kind of talking this threat into reality, that if we start sort of manifesting this threat, how bad it could be, and then suddenly we have to move ships into the South China Sea, and then they have to respond, and suddenly there's a standoff, and suddenly there's a war, mainly due to foreign policy people such as the people sitting on this sofa who are all getting excited about theoretical possibilities. I know there will be people watching who will say, is there not a more peaceful, just stop talking about it, stop manifesting it, chill out about it, and everything will be fine.
The thing that you described is called a security dilemma. It's a spiral model. When you have like a small country which faces a threat from a great power, it pulls a big country out. The big country here then faces a threat, starts to rearm. It becomes a spiral. It's a spiral model. The thing about the spiral model is it doesn't matter what we talk about. If it's going to happen, it's going to happen. So we might keep our mouth shut and just not look at Taiwan in a map from now on. If China wants to go to war, it will go to war. What we could do is what Rich Colby mentioned, deter China, although I don't agree with his final policy position that if the deterrence fails, we're going to go to war. But what we could do is imagine that Taiwan is going to be armed to the teeth so that just in case China attacks, either way, China is bled, white or whatever. Anyway.
We're going to take some questions, which is what we're supposed to be doing. Let's take maybe a couple. We can get one from this side and then one from over here.
Okay. Can you hear me? Yes.
Yeah.
Excellent. So,
don't forget, we're questions looking for questions.
Yes. Could you comment on the non-military threat that Russia poses? And I'm specifically thinking about the intelligence, the cultural, and the criminal threat, and maybe in particular in relation to this country, because the distinction was drawn between, say, woke culture and a military threat, say, in the Ukraine. I think that isn't a true distinction because, believe me, I think Russian military intelligence is very happy when the British military is paralyzed with questions of gender diversity and when the British establishment is wasting political, basically, capital on deciding what a woman is.
Okay. So we got some cultural questions there. Did I see a hand up in the middle at one stage? There was a lady with the hand up. I'd like to hold. Can we just? Sorry, there's a lady in the middle who had her hand up. I was quite keen to get some gender diversity in the room.
Thank you. Sort of slightly a point to what you were just saying, Freddie, but some would argue that Russia's been very clear for quite a while that they weren't happy with the expansion of NATO to the Ukraine. How far do we think that if the Ukraine were to fall, Putin isn't actually keen to keep expanding westwards? We're talking about sort of arming ourselves in defence, but how far do we think it is likely that we would need to defend ourselves? Would the war stop there?
Okay. So there's two different questions there, and you can just
Oh,
pick
should I
whichever one
okay.
you like. There's,
All right.
there's the question
I was
of
thinking that you were going to...
the threat from Russia and whether we are too woke to respond to it. And then will they stop at Ukraine or will they carry on? Take your pick.
I'll take the second one first, because the first one would need more more thought to be thinking about what I say in camera. The second question is if, as the Spartans once replied, if Russia takes over Ukraine, Russians would have to spend gazillions in pacifying the country. It's a country of 37 million people, 8 million moved away from last count, but it's still pretty strong. They're going to face resistance. They have to have a whole new set of elite police force to pacify. I mean, it's not just, Ukraine has been nationalized in the last 3-4 years to the point which is that their entire identity has been shaped by the war. So to have that kind of a country, think of the Germans in Greece during the Second World War. It's very difficult to occupy and then pacify a hostile crowd. Whether after that the Russians might, I think the threat from Russia is fomenting, which brings to the second question, the first question, fomenting local problems. So there are parts in the Baltics which might be, problematic, and the Russians might foment some kind of disorder there. Austria is obviously neutral nominally, but there's a significant pro-Russian sentiment. Eastern parts of Germany. But to answer those questions, yes, there are domestic and cultural and intelligence and policing threats, but you have to remember two things. One, the Russian intelligence are massive and scary, but they're also extremely incompetent. Now, I'm not making it up. I can't give details to what the intelligence that you can be privy to, but it's very old-fashioned in a way, and the times have moved on, and they haven't really realized that. So they kind of do weird things like killing people with medicine and poison and stuff like that, which is. But it's also, given that their policies are very old-fashioned, it could be tackled with an old-fashioned counterintelligence, is my point. So yes, there are threats to Russia fomenting problems in the West, especially in Central Europe, but those are not existential to the life, to the system of this country. The existential threat will only be if there is a Russian, carrier group in the English Channel, and I don't see that's happening.
I want to hear what Aris has to say, but let's line up a question from the online audience.
An Aris-specific question.
Oh,
Chat, so you can answer that and this.
Okay.
Aris, it's a double whammy. Crate God, another good username.
What is it? Crate God?
Crate God.
Okay.
And hopefully not a euphemism, says, can Aris suggest what position a Starmer government might adopt, re a foreign policy towards Russia in the event of a dormant NATO, reluctant EU military spending, and a persistent conflict in Ukraine over the next 5 years?
Starmer is an Atlanticist to his bone. I think there'd be very little distinction between a Starmer government and even a Johnson government or a Sunak government. Like, the entire British political establishment is wedded to the transatlantic alliance in a way that, in a sense, blinds Britain to other potential ways of being. I mean, look, Britain is a classic middle power in this kind of growing multipolar world or environment. Other middle powers, I mean, Turkey's a good example. It's completely amoral and in some ways, not a wholesome power, but it's pressed its advantage, it's pressed its situation to its own advantage. It's done well out of the current kind of shifting global environment. Britain is wedded to a world that doesn't exist anymore, and the entire British establishment, are committed to a model that is dead. So I don't expect the Starmer government to be any different to our current government or any other government we've had in my lifetime.
Okay.
I hope Craig God isn't kind of prone to depression.
In terms of the other questions,
Can I just specifically on that previous question, the one I want to point in your direction, because how the sort of presence of Russia in the internal culture war conversation is a really interesting development, and famously there are people on the political right who are surprisingly maybe not sympathetic but prepared to give Vladimir Putin time, where historically that was the political left who were more prone to being interested in what was happening in Russia. What's your view on that? Do you think that's a real... What's your comment on it?
People on the right are Russia curious. The same on the left as well. You could see before RT was banned, whatever it is, you could see that Russian propaganda tried to cover both bases. So, if you look at actually on social media, if you look at the kind of Russian propaganda efforts in Europe, it tries on the one hand, it has too many immigrants in Europe, it's all chaos, blah blah blah. We should be more like based Russia. On the other hand, the same state propaganda organs are evil, racist Western Europe being bad to Africa. So there's a kind of incoherence. The fringes of both sides will always be attracted to, the other.
Can I add something to that?
Sorry, can I quickly?
Please.
But in terms of the idea that the army's too woke to fight Russia, I think the armed forces are too woke for want of a better word. But if Britain went to war with Russia, it wouldn't be because of that. It's because we don't have enough tanks, we don't have enough men, and we don't produce enough shells. That's why. And the wokeness is like 0.0001% of why we would lose a direct conversation with Russia.
Let's take one more question, because you can...
I just want to add a very small thing to this one. There is this Russia curiosity on the right. I think that's stupid. Just because you're opposed to spending money in Ukraine doesn't mean the Russians are good. I want to make that very clear. This idea on the right that Russia is this Christian nationalist civilization, it's not. It's an empire. It's a multi-ethnic empire. There are Chechens who are fighting in Ukraine, and also they're ruthless. So one needs to differentiate between the idea of a balanced, prudent, realist foreign policy and being a weird kind of right-wing.
Okay. Let's get some... Yeah, there's a guy here on the right, and there's somebody over here. We can get a couple of questions.
One can imagine that, like in the first Trump administration, that there was universal resistance within an American bureaucracy to his policies, refusal to implement them in many cases. You saw articles in the New York Times and Washington Post that were saying 80 people have, attested to this leak or whatever it is. How do you imagine overcoming the bureaucratic resistance within the American government to your vision?
Deep state, you're referring to. Okay, there's another guy just next door who I know has been very keen to ask a question.
Hi. Given that no one would argue World War I was caused by Germany invading Luxembourg or Belgium, or World War II was caused by Germany invading Poland, in 50 years' time, what will historians say about who caused World War III?
Big question. Okay, I'm gonna. Does anyone want to take that before we're going to go to the other side? Who started World War III? Go.
Why did you do that, Aris?
I'd like to think there won't be a World War III.
Yeah, I don't think so.
That's what we're here to achieve.
Yeah, I agree, and also I slightly disagree. Yes, the proximal cause of the First World War was German, imperialism, but it was fundamentally a breakdown of balance of power. So I think we tend to study more World War II about this binary idea of good and bad. But fundamentally, we have to study World War I because we are in an emerging multipolarity, and the balance of power might break down. You might have people like the Edwardians who are hysteric about morals and values and going to war and shaping the country and forgetting that you're going to lose your empire because of that. But so yeah, First World War is a little more complicated than the second. What was the second question?
The other question was
Deep
about
state.
the administrative state and whether they would oppose any radical change of direction.
Well, the president can get 6,000 people on day one. That's direct presidential employment appointees. There is this NSC, which is 200 people. That's directly appointed by the president. The broad Pentagon bureaucracies are almost around 70,000 people. Most of them are normal people. They don't really have a side. There are obviously people who are ideological, and they will be. It's a free country. No one is going to stop the New York Times from writing what it wants to write. But I think the big problem with Trump in the first administration was he had no idea that he was going to win. So he wasn't really prepared with the team. This time it's different. So hopefully, if things...
If he picks the right people, you think he might get some things
Fingers
done.
crossed. Someone might even give him good advice on NATO. Good to see you.
Yeah, it's good to see you too. If this does come about, if we do get a dormant NATO, then how do you think it's going to affect like UK and European foreign policy and diplomacy? Specifically, the two Europes that you mentioned before in your paper. So how would a dormant NATO affect diplomacy in the United Kingdom and Europe?
Again, I am not advising the British government, so it depends on which course of action it wants to take. It might double down, as Aris said, on liberal hegemony and liberal internationalism, and it might be more prone to tie itself to the European, continental power, or it might have a more balanced approach where it finds itself as a middling balancing power between America and Europe. If I were to advise the British government, I would suggest the course number 3, but that's not my place to talk about.
Course number 3 is, as I recall, the detached.
The more detached,
pragmatic,
pragmatic,
deal making.
Depending on an interest, yes.
Thank you. This is the last question, by the way.
Can I just come back to that discussion on what would happen to Ukraine if there was a Russian breakthrough? Because I don't think we really consider the implications of that quite enough. Can you imagine what the Russians would do to the Ukrainians if they broke through? They've already done it in Chechnya and Syria. Might that be enough to galvanise the West, and might that change America's view of NATO?
When you say galvanise the West, do you mean like if NATO is going to go to war? Because that's not going to happen.
Even if Ukraine falls, NATO would...
Even if Ukraine falls, I seriously doubt NATO is going to go to war over Ukraine. If that means... The problem with Ukraine is not just ammunitions or weaponry, it's manpower. The reason Russians have an escalation dominance in Ukraine is because there are instances in Avdiivka where they had 15-to-1 soldiers. That could only be offset by manpower from the West. The Ukrainians wanted to do that with a foreign legion. It didn't happen because there are a lot more people to tweet than actually to go to war. So I seriously doubt we would risk even a potential or even a conventional war with Russia over Mariupol. So that is not going to happen. What might happen if Ukraine falls is, one, the Russians are going to face an insurgency which would be far more brutal than Chechnya. Chechnya could be guarded down from all sides. Ukraine cannot. It has got borders with Poland. Weapons passing in a porous border is a lot, more a lot easier. So it might face an insurgency in Ukraine, and there might be potentially more arms production in Europe. Fingers crossed.
I'd like to end with a vote. I know it's not a debate and we haven't had a motion, but I'm really curious to see how the audience in the room, unfortunately we can't do this with the online audience, how you conclude. I'm not going to try and make you choose options 1, 2 and 3 because we probably can't remember which they were. But I've got two bigger picture questions. First is, do you think that we are witnessing the kind of large-scale, great seismic change that these guys have been talking about? In other words, do you think the world order is undergoing a seismic shift at the moment? Or do you think that it's a lot of hysteria, people getting overexcited, and probably, if we take the next 20 years as a time period, things might look quite similar to how they do today in 20 years. So put your hand up if you think we are in the middle of a seismic shift. And put your hand up if you think it's overblown and things might be more similar than people realize. Interesting. I think we have a majority for a seismic shift, not calling for one, but predicting one. And the other one, too early to tell. The other one, it's kind of grim. It's grim just before we send you off to go and get a drink at the bar. Do you think there's going to be a war in the next 10 years that involves Western countries to a much greater degree than anything like we've seen in Ukraine? Do you think there's going to be a big war in the next 10 years? If you believe there is, raise your hand. Only 4 or 5 or 6, 7 hands. If you think there is going to be no big war like that in the next 10 years, raise your hand. See, that's a happy conclusion, friends. I told you we'd have a happy conclusion. Thank you all. Thank you, Dr. Sumantra Maitra. Thank you, Aris Roussinos. And thank you all for joining online as well. No war. It's official.